Hello and welcome back to the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. Thanks for tuning in with us. This week, Jayden and I will be discussing rabies.
Yeah, this is one I think that we've been talking about doing for a little while, but it's a disease that I think is really interesting and that kind of doesn't get enough attention because of how dangerous it can kind of be, but that we don't hear about it very often in Canada, I don't think. So, what is rabies?
Rabies, it's a viral infection and it's usually transmitted through a bite or saliva of an infected animal. So the virus, basically what happens, you get bitten, the skin is broken, and essentially what ends up happening at that point is the virus in the saliva can get into your bloodstream, and then you're infected and it kind of goes from there. It's possible that you could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bite. It could be a scratch or a cut. So that's always a concern. I've even heard of, they think there could have been some cases in the past where maybe even by a dog licking a person, there could have been a risk. And what really happens with rabies, as I mentioned, it's a virus and it does affect your nervous system, and it takes usually some time, but it can progress and will progress and is definitely lethal.
Right. So, what do the symptoms look like when you are infected with rabies?
I think a lot of times it would really initially present itself more like the flu, but then at that point, it sort of goes into, more severe and symptoms where, it's mental things like hallucinations and delirium and fear of water, which is always a strange one. And and it will kill you. Basically, it essentially will, once it gets into your nervous system, there's very limited things we can do. Over all the years, there's only been a handful of people that have survived rabies. There's no obvious treatment. There's been a few really weird experimental things that have been done, and I don't really even know too much to talk about it, but I know there was one thing where they were lowering people's body temperature in order to fight advanced rabies, and with limited success, of course, very little success. And I think from Jayden's weekly advance research, she came up with this, and it probably sounds about right, about 60,000 human deaths a year from rabies, and 40% in kids under 15, and 95% of those deaths are in Africa or Asia, even though the virus exists everywhere pretty much except Antarctica. So, but the reason that we're seeing it in those countries is more speaking to the lack of proper follow-up and access to medical care than anything else.
Right. Yeah, I can recall doing some early research on this, not for the podcast specifically, but for something else, and finding out that the survival rate is so extremely low, kind of struck a deep fear of rabies into my heart, even though I don't work with animals and don't normally interact with any animals that might be a risk factor to me. But what are the animals that are the most common rabies vectors, that are the most common to kind of pass it to humans?
In the grand scheme of things, dogs transmit the disease to humans most of the time. Now, that's more in the global sense. Now,
Right.
In a local sense, like as in a Canada sense, it's usually bat transmission. We
Right.
have basically, because of comprehensive vaccine programs in animals and dogs, cases of dog rabies in Canada and North America are virtually non-existent.
Right.
So in North America, bats are by far the most common. Like I said, other things, raccoons, skunks, coyotes, foxes, any mammal can theoretically carry it. And like I said, if for around the world, most infections to humans are dog-based. But in the very rare case in Canada where it happens, I'm not even sure when the last case was transmitted from a dog to human that resulted in death. It's been a long time. All of the bad outcomes in Canada that I've heard of late have all been related to bats.
Right. And I'm also terrified of bats. I think they're creepy, weird birds that shouldn't exist. But I think that we have this kind of like a common media conception about what like a rabid animal looks like, but what do symptoms actually tend to look like in animals? Is there kind of a way to actually tell that an animal is rabid, or is that kind of like a myth or a misconception?
When you think about the media portrayals of rabid dogs and the whole idea of a dog foaming at the mouth, that's not really how it works, typically speaking. But there are ways you can still tell potentially that, or telltale signs that there might be something up with the animal. There is increased saliva production, so that's more closer than what you're going to see as opposed to foaming at the mouth. One of the other things, though, which is probably more of a telltale sign, is unusual behavior.
Right.
Lots of times it can be an animal might be more aggressive, or it's acting weird in general. And I think that in some of the cases with bats with rabies, that has been part of the reason. Like, bats usually don't like humans. They try to get away from humans as much as they can. But if a bat going out and or biting a human and acting unusual in that sense is probably a real warning sign.
Right.
But the only way you can really determine whether an animal has rabies or not is to do lab testing.
Right. So kind of on that, is there anything that can be done to prevent rabies?
So I guess when you think about it, like, the obvious thing is staying away from any suspicious animals and, caution in that sense. Like, from a traveling perspective, in a lot of countries, there are stray animals like dogs that are on the street. Now, a lot of times they're not necessarily the friendliest that you can go up and touch them, but sometimes they are. And even with other animals like monkeys and stuff, there can be situations where they could be, you may be able to touch them, you may be able to interact with them a little bit, try and feed them. That can certainly be a problem, and I think that those are probably the things that you can do off the bat. And then the other thing you should always keep in mind is with kids. Now, kids may be less inclined to pay attention to the idea, like they see a cute dog or a cute monkey or whatever, and they might be far more inclined to want to try to interact with it, and that's always a concern. And the other thing, of course, you can do is, if there ever is a concern about being bitten or scratched, you want to wash the area out like crazy with soap and water, and then that we know it will help potentially remove some of the virus if it's remove the saliva and remove the virus. And then, of course, the last thing from a preventative standpoint, there is a vaccine.
Right. And so obviously we want to touch on the vaccine a little bit. So kind of how does it work, and what is kind of the procedure for administering it to somebody?
Well, with rabies vaccine, there's really two ways that you always want to think about rabies vaccine. What we would call, pre-exposure and then post-exposure.
Right.
So pre-exposure essentially is getting the vaccine done in advance because you think you're at high risk. We think about people that work with animals, like veterinarians or veterinary staff, or for that matter, some kind of animal control workers, or anybody who is at higher risk, where you're going on a trip where we consider there to be a higher risk. You can get vaccines done in advance. And usually how it's done, it's an inactivated vaccine. You get a series of 3 doses. You get one done the initial day, you get one done 7 days later, and then a third dose 21 to 28 days later. And then that's essentially it. You've gotten your pre-exposure course done. And then when you start going the other direction, the post-exposure, then that's when you are talking about getting the vaccine essentially after the fact, and where there's been a concern that you've possibly been infected, and then you need to go through a series of doses, and it's a little bit more of an involved process, but basically that's the other way of doing it, where you essentially get it after the fact.
Right. So how long are you protected by the pre-exposure vaccine? How long does your kind of immunity last there?
Well, really, when it comes right down to it, we don't have a definitive number. We think that like, because it's rabies and it's so important to make sure you're up to date, the only real true guideline is by doing lab work.
Right.
So what we would advise is for people to get their lab work done from time to time. And essentially it's a blood test and they can measure your level of antibodies in your system. Just to give you an idea, people that are working in veterinary clinics, that sort of thing, I believe that most of the veterinary associations recommend that their antibodies should be tested every 2 years, as sort of just a routine thing. So, but we typically don't like test people that got the vaccine for traveling until we think they're going to go at higher risk. So we wouldn't just call people in every 2 years automatically. But, I've seen people who the vaccine has lasted after the initial course of 3 for probably close to a decade, but then for other people, not so much. So it is variable and no one really wants to commit to a defined time.
Right. So kind of on that, I did want to kind of give you an opportunity to mention that you're thinking of offering kind of like a virtual service for veterinarians because of how not necessarily complicated, but how inconvenient the process of getting tested for antibodies can be, like for people who are busy veterinarians or vet clinic workers. So if you want to kind of mention that or talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I guess probably the best place to start is, how does it all work when you do want to get your levels tested? So whether you're a veterinarian or somebody who got the shots for travel in the past, really what you have to do is you need to get a lab requisition from someone who can provide that, whether it's your family doctor or a clinic like ours. You go get your lab test done at a lab, and then it takes usually about 3 weeks to get your results back. And then you need to get informed of your results. Now, every location is different. Some family doctors' offices, you have to rebook an appointment with them to get the results, and then things kind of go from there. So yeah, we're looking at some options here to make that all a lot simpler and virtual, and keep watching, and hopefully that'll be something we'll be able to get going here in the not too distant future. But I guess the one thing I want to mention is, if your levels are good, then we feel pretty confident that we can leave things probably for a couple more years at least. If your levels do come back low, we don't restart the series.
Right.
What we basically do is we give you a booster dose.
Right. And is that kind of like, is there a determined amount of the vaccine that you receive as a booster dose, or is it kind of...
It's the same amount as you would have gotten on the initial series. There's no special strength. It's just another dose of what you would have got in the initial 3.
Right. And then how soon after you get that booster dose is it recommended that you get kind of tested again to see if it has kind of given you enough immunity?
Usually we're looking at sort of a month. We want to kind of give your body a bit of time to make sure it has a chance to create antibodies. So usually we're thinking sort of in that 1 month time frame.
Right. Okay. Kind of moving on from there, what happens if you were to be bit by an animal? What kind of should you be doing, and how long do you kind of have to receive that post-exposure treatment before it's kind of too late and you're in, I don't want to say like the death zone, but in a bad spot where you're,
Kind of sort of is the death zone.
It kind of is. Yeah.
So here's what would happen if you got bit or scratched by a monkey or a dog or whatever it is. The first thing you do, whether you've been vaccinated or not, is you wash the area out like crazy with running water and soap, and really try to clean the area up. That helps with even just a bacterial type infection from maybe the animals, not even a rabies virus, but just from a generalized infection. And if there is any rabies virus in the saliva, well, then it would help wash that away and decrease the chance of it getting, fully absorbed into your bloodstream. So that's the first thing you do no matter what. Then basically how you look at it is, you go down the 2 paths, whether you've been vaccinated in advance, pre-vaccinated in advance, or you haven't. If you haven't been pre-vaccinated, you really need to figure out a plan of getting some post-exposure doses in you, usually quite quickly. We always want to think like a 48, 72 hours later, we want to make sure that you've started the process. And usually what the process will involve is a series of the same rabies vaccines that you would have got preventatively. But really what ends up happening is you get one done, you get another one done 3 days later, another one done 4 days after that, which is 7 days after the first one, and then another one a week after that. So these need to be done, and we're very sticky about the days. You got to get them done on the exact days, and we want to make sure we're on top of that. And we also would, if it's available, use something called a rabies immunoglobulin, which is basically antibodies that are already active antibodies that are already pre-made, and you a lot of times will inject that near the bite site. And that can help prevent the infection from progressing. And really, the idea behind the timing here is, you need to get on top of this. The virus doesn't kill you like instantly. The die is not cast right away. Essentially, what ends up happening is, as that virus works its way through your nervous system, and once it gets to your brain, essentially, that's when we kind of hit the point of no return.
Right.
And then if you have received the vaccine in advance, you still need to follow up for medical attention, but it's not quite as urgent. You don't necessarily have to drop everything you're doing. You need to get to see a doctor at your earliest opportunity. And usually at that point, if there is some immunoglobulin available, which lots of times it's not available in some developing countries, do some immunoglobulin by the injection site, and then do a booster of the vaccine. Lots of times we'll even look at doing a second booster, 2 boosters, but you want to at least get 1 booster in you right away just to make sure that your immunity is all topped up. And then really at that point, that's usually as far as we go with it. So that's kind of the process. There's the 2 different steps, or 2 different pathways, I guess.
Right. And so when you do have either course done, depending on your vaccine status, is there kind of like a checkup point after that to ensure that it's actually worked and that the disease isn't progressing?
Yeah, like what will end up happening is there will be follow-up in regards to like making sure the doses are all done and checking on infection. And as far as ultimately like trying to verify an acute infection, I'm actually not even sure if there is a way to measure virus in the system or not. But yeah, you definitely need to be doing some follow-up and everything. Now, certainly if you're back already, if this was a situation where it happened in Canada or it happened in another country, but you're back in Canada, there's a lot of good follow-up that's done. Here, if you are still overseas, then a lot of it becomes incumbent on you to follow up. So that's always a consideration and a concern. That's one of the things about rabies vaccine where I a lot of times will look at it for people that are traveling. And one of my big key factors, like obviously, are you likely to be exposed to those type of animals? Are you going to work in a primate animal, like a primate shelter? Well, I would be definitely telling you to get, pre-vaccinated for rabies. Are you going to be spending a lot of time in caves where there's bats? That's something where you probably would really want to get it done too. But then if you're not doing the high risk activities, then one of my big questions is, how close are you to medical attention? A country like Nepal, where there's lots of rabid dogs and not great access to medical facilities, one of the things that would always be my nightmare scenario would be, so you're trekking and you're walking in Nepal, and you walk into some village, and some rabid dog comes out of nowhere and bites you, and you wash it all out and everything like that. And then what do you do? Like, you're 2 days walk away from civilization, and another day or 2 walk from even possible decent medical treatment. What do you do? Do you turn around? Do you end your trip, like essentially, and go back? You pretty much kind of have to, because you can't really keep going, because if you are infected, you need to get on top of that. So that would be a factor on whether I would want to recommend the vaccine, because you could probably carry on if you've already been vaccinated, but you really couldn't if you didn't have the pre-exposure vaccine.
Right. So how often would you say you do recommend it, and you end up prescribing that vaccine for a traveler specifically?
Not terribly often, but on a reasonably regular basis for remote travel, adventure travel. Nepal is like one of the places where I'm always thinking about it because of the fact that they have a lot of rabid dog issues there, and but a lot of African and Asian countries, there's certainly a concern. Um, you think about it, and what's your real risk? What's your access to medical care? And then also affordability. It's an expensive vaccine. So, you're
Right.
looking at, in the 230-ish range for a dose. So, some people, if you have a good drug plan and the plan pays for most of it, well, great. It's a well-tolerated vaccine and inactivated vaccine. There's not a lot of significant side effects from the standpoint there. So it, generally speaking, is well tolerated. It's just really expensive. So we basically have to make those kind of determinations about, affordability and risk and access to medical care.
Right. Okay. Well, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to mention about rabies? Any other kind of little anecdotes about it that you wanted to touch on, or?
Oh, so many anecdotes. I could tell you many, many. I will tell you one though, because it is one that I do quite enjoy, and I quite a few years back already. But anyway, a friend, like a personal friend, they basically were in Thailand, and this is sort of what happened. We get a call, and it was in the evening, somewhat later than you typically would get a phone call, and we're like, "What's going on? I thought you guys were in Thailand." And they're like, "Well, we just got back, but we want to check in because I got bit by a monkey in Thailand, and so what's the story? What happened?" Well, there was this thing in Thailand where get your picture taken with the monkey for like $20. So the monkey was in a cage, and it's like your tourist scam type thing. You can get your picture taken with the monkey on your shoulder, and then you can, show everyone this cool picture. Anyway, they did that, and while the monkey was sitting on his shoulder, it bit him. And so essentially what happened was they were like, "What should we do? This happened a couple days ago, right before we were getting ready to leave. We never sought medical attention. It's looking red and puffy. What should we do?" So I said, "Well, basically you should just go straight to the hospital." And at that point, what ended up happening was, he got all of the post-exposure doses. He also got antibiotics because the bite was infected and like with some kind of bacterial infection. And it all turned out good in the end. But definitely that was sort of the example of a situation where, why did that monkey bite him? You would think it would have been relatively used to being on the shoulders of people, that sort
Right.
of thing, unusual behavior. And yeah, so basically he ended up getting all his post-exposure vaccines and all that follow-up done, here in Alberta, and got all the follow-up done. But yeah, I told him afterwards, I said, "I'll be telling that story forever." And he's like, "Yeah, I know." Here it is, telling it on the podcast.
Oh goodness. Yeah, it's unusual because you see a lot of, well, like social media posts about, the monkeys, and normally the problem that people have is that they steal your sunglasses or they take your watch off your wrist or something like that, not necessarily that they would bite you, but I guess that would be kind of a sneaky risk for something like that. Not only just rabies, but also for some sort of just random bacterial infection.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the thing is sometimes when you're doing some of these activities, like it's one thing even to say that, I'm going to be real careful. But sometimes I think it can be a situation that can be a bit out of your control. I remember I had a guy in here who never came and saw us before his trip for an appointment, but he followed up with us when he was done because he actually needed his last dose of his post-exposure doses because he got all the other ones done. He got bit by a monkey in Bali
Oh,
at one of the monkey temples or something like that. And he said that the monkey basically jumped out of nowhere and bit him, and he didn't really feel like he could have done much better. And, he wasn't vaccinated for rabies in advance because, it was not something really on the radar screen, but he was in Bali. So there was good medical care there. So he got, I think, I remember all the details right now, but his first couple doses of vaccine were done in Bali. And then he had moved on, I think, to another location. I think it was in the Philippines or something. And he found a medical clinic there to get the next dose done. And then he needed his last dose done when he was back in Canada. So he had just followed up with us because he was already, well down the follow-up road. But I remember him saying that he kind of feels like, he didn't really feel like he was really, tempting fate to any degree. He was just, it just happens. So stuff like that can happen. And of course, it was all, fine outcome for him. But those are the kinds of things. And, even, here in Canada, the cases of rabies deaths are very few and far between, fortunately. But most of the time, what we've been finding is there are situations where people got bit by a bat and never followed up. Isn't that weird? I got bit by a bat, but never thought to do any real follow-up and checkups on that. There's been a couple of cases like that which have come up over the last decade or so. And they're kind of sad stories. And I obviously it's sad the person died, but it was one of those things where, unfortunately, if they would have thought, or someone would have told them to get followed up, they would still be here. But
yeah, it really is too bad. And in those situations, and in, many other situations in developing countries where, they could be something done if there was access to medical care, because it is a treatable thing prior to, you developing symptoms. But I think there's probably a lot of people out there that don't know or aren't able to access that and end up, in a pretty unfortunate situation.
Oh, totally. I think that's a huge issue. The access to care is just not there. Where even if there's some kind of concern, there may not be access to the vaccine or whatever, or even the knowledge, to get checked out. So it's really unfortunate. This is something that, in theory, like, we could prevent all the cases, all the deaths, but just the world and how everything works, and access to care and finances and all that sort of geopolitical stuff that prevents that from happening.
Yeah. Well, anyways, anything else that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, one thing I'll mention, which I just think it's a weird little fact, but I wouldn't necessarily use this if I got bit by an animal, but where you get bit really amounts to how much time you have. Does that make sense? Like, if you get bit on the foot or on the ankle or on the leg, the virus takes a longer period of time to essentially work its way up into your brain. So, I wouldn't necessarily say that I would be all, I got bit in the leg, I got time. I would get followed up. But in theory, we know that someone that gets bit, say, on the upper shoulder or on the neck, they have a chance of developing symptoms and essentially hitting that point of no return for death much faster than someone who got bit lower down.
Right. Like, how much faster would you say?
Like, I think the time can be measured, maybe in days, or even to the point, like, days to maybe a week or two. Like, I don't know if I know that directly, but we know that there, in cases of people who have survived, being infected and have been in situations where their outcome was better, it was for people, one of the things that they noticed that was consistent was people that got bit on the lower extremities seemed to do a bit better than someone who got bit on the neck, for example.
Right. Well, that's kind of unfortunate. Get a vampire bite essentially from a bat, and it's over.
Well, not quite over, but yeah, no, I know what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the real life situation of bats is not Count Dracula type of stuff. It's just sad rabies things.
Yeah, rabies is a really, it's a pretty grim topic, but it's actually a very interesting topic. I could probably sit here and, talk about various different cases and things that I've personally seen, and other cases that have been relayed to me over the years and stuff. There's a lot of interesting material there, and I think it's a pretty fascinating area, but it's also kind of a grim one too.
Definitely. Well, I watched a video of somebody with the hydrophobia, the water fear. And it's truly scary to think that that's your mind overpowering. You're not able to overcome this kind of like pure symptom of rabies to the point where you can't even drink water manually because how the disease has progressed.
Yeah, I remember I went to a conference and I was on at a presentation for rabies, and I can't remember who gave this, but this talk. But I still remember the one thing that she had said in the presentation. What are the 3 worst ways to die? And she kind of waited to see if anyone wanted to like raise their hand or whatever. And she goes, "I'll give you the answer. The 3 worst ways to die are rabies, rabies, and rabies." Yeah.
Yeah. Things can get pretty bad with it.
Yeah. Well, on that happy note, I think we've kind of covered everything that I want to cover. Is there anything else you want to mention, Jayden?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't recommend going out and searching for the morbid symptoms of rabies, but if you do happen to see them, it is kind of interesting. But yeah, I'll thank you guys for tuning into this week's edition of the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. A reminder that the information and advice that we provided in this podcast are not a substitute for live medical advice tailored to your specific itinerary and your medical history. If you have questions or you want to book an appointment, please head over to our website, www.polaristravelclinic.ca, and there is a new website on the way. But also check us out on Twitter at Polaris Travel RX and our Facebook page as well. We hope that you'll tune in again with us next week.
Thanks, Jayden.
Thank you.